Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to a series of videos in which I am reading you a book. We are reading Barchester Towers by Anthony Trollope, and our story is picking up steam. The Proudies, the new bishop of Barchester, Mr. Proudy, and his imperious wife, Mrs. Proudy, and their odious chaplain, Mr. Slope, uh, have put down power in Barchester and are starting to try to get their own way in all things. And one of the ways that Mrs. Proudy comes up with to do this is to have a huge bash, a huge party, a reception to which everyone in the neighborhood is invited so that she can lord it over all of them. But the fly in the ointment here is that one of the first things that the new bishop did in Barchester was to issue an edict that all of his wandering clergymen, all of his prelates and prebendaries and whatnots, who are reaping the full salary of their office without ever doing the work, need to come back to Barchester. There won't be any absentee office holders anymore. And one of the foremost offenders there was Dr. Vesey Stanhope, who has been in Italy on the shores of Lake Como for 15 to 20 years. He's raised his family there, including his two weird children. He has three children. Two of them are weird. There's the older daughter, who's controlling and cold. But then there's the younger daughter, who we were given a long biography of her. She ran away with an Italian scoundrel, and when she returned to the bosom of the family, she was not only without the husband, and she was not only with a small child, but she was crippled and could not walk without badly limping, and is taken to being carried everywhere and draped on sofas. And also the son, Ethelbert, Bertie, who is weird. He has spent time as a fervent Christian, spent time as a sculptor, spent time as a painter, spent time as a convert to Judaism, and has arrived at this big neighborhood party dressed head to toe in bright blue with a long pharisaical beard. And that is where we left the party in the last chapter. This is a scene that Trollope has chosen to split in two. This gathering is in full force, and the focus of all of it is La Signora Neroni, Dr. Stanhope's daughter, who is draped on a sofa in bright white with beautiful jewels, and is the mesmerizing center of attention for every man in the room. That's where the next chapter continues, which is chapter 11, Mrs. Proudy's Reception Concluded. "Bishop of Barchester, I presume?" said Bertie Stanhope, putting out his hand frankly. "I'm delighted to make your acquaintance. We are rather close quarters here, aren't we?" In truth, they were. They had been crowded up behind the head of the sofa, the bishop in waiting to receive his guest and the other to carry her in, and now they had hardly room to move themselves. The bishop gave his hand quickly and made his little studied bow, and was delighted to make... He couldn't go on, for he did not know whether his friend was a signor or a count or a prince. "My sister really puts you all to great trouble," said Bertie. "Not at all," said the bishop, and was delighted to have the opportunity of welcoming La Signora Vinci Neroni. So at least he said, and attempted to force his way round the front of the sofa. He had, at any rate, learnt that his strange guests were brother and sister. The man, he presumed, must be Signor Vinci Neroni, or count, or prince, as it might be. It was wonderful that what good English he spoke. There was just a twang of a foreign accent, no more. "Do you like Barchester on the whole?" asked Bertie. The bishop looked dignified and said that he did like Barchester. "You've not been here very long, I believe," said Bertie. "No, not long," said the bishop, and tried again to make his way between the back of the sofa and a heavy rector who was staring over it at the grimaces of the signora. "You weren't a bishop before, were you?" Dr. Proudy explained that this was the first diocese he had held. "Ah, I thought so," said Bertie. "But you are changed about sometimes, ain't you?" "Translations have occasionally been made," said Dr. Proudy, "but not so frequently as in former days." "They've cut them all down pretty nearly the same figure, haven't they?" said Bertie. To this the bishop could not bring himself to make an answer, but again attempted to move the rector. "But the work, I suppose, is different?" continued Bertie. "Is there much to do here at Barchester?" This was said in exactly the same tone as a young admiralty clerk might use asking the same question of a brother acolyte at the treasury. "The work of a bishop of the Church of England," said Dr. Proudy with considerable dignity, "is not easy." The responsibility which he has to bear is very great indeed. Is it? Said Bertie, opening wide his wonderful blue eyes. Well, I never was afraid of responsibility. I once had thoughts of being a bishop myself. Had thoughts of being a bishop, said Dr. Proudie, much amazed. That is, a parson first, you know, and a bishop afterwards. If I had once begun, I'd have stuck to it. But on the whole, I like the Church of Rome best. The bishop could not discuss the point, so he remained silent. Now there's my father, continued Bertie. He hasn't stuck to it. I fancy he didn't like saying the same thing over so often. By the by, Bishop, have you seen my father? The bishop was more amazed than ever. Had he seen his father? No, he replied. He had not yet had the pleasure. He hoped he might. And as he said so, he resolved to bear heavy on that fat, immovable rector if ever he had the power of doing so. He's in the room somewhere, said Bertie, and he'll turn up soon. By the by, do you know much about the Jews? At last the bishop saw a way out. I beg your pardon, he said, but I'm forced to go round the room. Well, I believe I'll follow in your wake, said Bertie. Terribly hot, isn't it? This he addressed to the fat rector with whom he had brought himself into the close contact. They've got this sofa in the very worst possible part of the room. Suppose we move it. Take care, Madeline. Madeline is his sister, who's on the sofa. The sofa had certainly been so placed that those who were behind it found great difficulty in getting out. There was but a narrow gangway which one person could stop. This was a bad arrangement, and one which Bertie thought it might be well to improve. Take care, Madeline, said he, and turning to the fat rector, added, just help me with a slight push. The rector's weight was resting on the sofa, and unwittingly lent all its impetus to accelerate and increase the motion which Bertie intentionally originated. The sofa rushed from its moorings and ran halfway into the middle of the room. Mrs. Proudie was standing with Mr. Slope in front of the signora, and had been trying to be condescending and sociable, but she was not in the very best of tempers, for she found that whenever she spoke to the lady replied by speaking to Mr. Slope. Mr. Slope was a favorite, no doubt, but Mrs. Proudie had no idea of being less thought of than the chaplain. She was beginning to be stately, stiff, and offended, when unfortunately the castor of the sofa caught itself in her lace train and carried away there is no saying how much of her garniture. Gathers were heard to go, stitches to crack, plates to fly open, flounces were seen to fall, and breadths have exposed themselves. A long ruin of rent lace disfigured the carpet, and still clung to the vile wheel on which the sofa moved. So, when a granite battery is raised, excellent to the eyes of warfaring men, is its strength and symmetry admired. It is the work of years. Its neat embrasures, its finished parapets, its casemated stories show all the skill of modern science. But anon a small spark is applied to the treacherous fusee, a cloud of dust arises to the heavens, and then nothing is to be seen but dirt and dust and ugly fragments. The narrator is comparing Mrs. Proudie's get-up to a toppled tower. We know what was the wrath of Juno when her beauty was despised. We know to what storms of passion even celestial minds can yield. As Juno may have looked at Paris on Mount Ida, so did Mrs. Proudie look on Ethelbert Stanhope when he pushed the leg of the sofa onto her lace train. That's a reference to Greek myth. We've already heard the myth of the golden apple, where the gods are feasting and someone tosses in a golden apple inscribed to the fairest. All the goddesses start to squabble over it because they all assume it's meant for them. It comes down to Minerva, Juno, and Venus, and they decide that the contest cannot be done by another god, that it has to be done by a mortal man, in this case Paris, a prince of Troy, an exiled prince of Troy, who gives the apple to Venus, of course. But that's not something that you do if the queen of the gods is standing right there. In Troy War, in the myth, Juno is very upset with Paris. In Troy War, she's a little bit more, in my novel of the Trojan War, she's a little bit more direct on what she does to him when he does that. But anyway, oh, you idiot, Bertie, said the signora, seeing what had been done and what were to be the consequences. Idiot, re-echoed Mrs. Proudie, as though the word were not half strong enough to express the required meaning. I'll let him know. And then looking round to learn at a glance the worst, she saw that at present it behooved her to collect the scattered debris of her dress. Bertie, when he saw what he had done, rushed over the sofa and threw himself on one knee before the offended lady. His object, doubtless, was to liberate the torn lace from the castor, but he looked as though he were imploring pardon from a goddess. Unhand it, sir, said Mrs. Proudie, From what scrap of dramatic poetry she had extracted the word cannot be said, but it must have rested in her memory and now seemed opportunely dignified for the occasion. "I'll fly to the looms of the fairies to repair the damage, if only you'll forgive me," said Ethelbert, still on his knees. "Unhand it, sir," said Mrs. Proudie, with redoubted emphasis and all but furious wrath. This allusion to fairies was a direct mockery, and intended to turn her into ridicule. So at least it seemed to her. "Unhand it, sir," she almost screamed. "It's not me, it's the cursed sofa," said Bertie, looking imploringly in her face and holding up both hands to show that he was not touching her belongings, but still remaining on his knees. Hereupon the Signora laughed. Not loud, indeed, but yet audibly. As the tigress bereft of her young will turn with equal anger on any within reach, so did Mrs. Proudie turn upon her female guest. "Madam," she said, and it is beyond the power of prose to tell the fire which flashed from her eyes. The Signora stared her full in the face for a moment, and then, turning to her brother, said playfully, "Bertie, you idiot, get up." By this time the bishop and Mr. Slope and her 3 daughters were around her, and had collected together the wide ruins of her magnificence. The girls fell into singular rank behind their mother, and thus followed her and carried out the fragments, and they left the reception rooms in a manner not altogether devoid of dignity. Mrs. Proudie had to retire and rearray herself. As soon as the constellation had swept by, Ethelbert rose from his knees, and, turning with mock anger to the fat rector, said, "After all, it was your doing, sir, not mine, but perhaps you are waiting for preferment, so I bore it." Whereupon there was a laugh against the fat rector, in which both the bishop and the chaplain joined, and thus things got themselves again into order. "Oh, my lord, I am so very sorry for this incident," said the Signora, putting out her hand so as to force the bishop to take it. "My brother is so thoughtless. Pray sit down, and let me have the pleasure of making your acquaintance. Though I am so poor a creature as to want a sofa, I am not so selfish as to require all of it." Madeline could always dispose herself so as to make room for a gentleman, though, as she declared, the crinoline of her lady friends was much too bulky to be so accommodating. "It was solely for the pleasure of meeting you that I have had myself dragged here," she continued. "Of course, with your occupation, one cannot even hope that you should have time to come to us. That is, in so stately... Excuse me. Do you know, my lord, that in coming to England my only consolation has been that I thought I should know you?" And she looked at him with the look of a she-devil. The bishop, however, thought that she looked like a very angel, and accepting the proffered seat, sat down beside her. He uttered some platitudes as to his deep obligation for the trouble she had taken, and wondered more and more who she was. "Of course you know my sad story," she continued. The bishop didn't know a word of it. He knew, however, or thought he knew, that she couldn't walk into a room like other people, and so made the most of that. He put on a look of ineffable distress, and said that he was aware how God had afflicted her. The Signora just touched the corner of her eyes with the most lovely of pocket handkerchiefs. Yes, she said, she had been sorely tried. Tried, she thought, beyond the common endurance of humanity. But while her child was left to her, everything was left. "Oh, my lord," she exclaimed, "you must see that infant, the last bud of a wondrous tree. You must let a mother hope that you will lay your holy hands upon her innocent head and consecrate her for female virtues. May I hope it?" she said, looking into the bishop's eyes and touching the bishop's arm with her hand. The bishop was but a man, and said she might. After all, what was it but a request that he would confirm her daughter? A request, indeed, very unnecessary to make, as he should do so as a matter of course, if the young lady came forward in the usual way. "The blood of Tiberius," said the Signora in all but a whisper. "The blood of Tiberius flows in her veins. She is the last of the Neros." The bishop had heard of the last of the Visigoths, and had floating in his brain, some indistinct idea about the last of the Mohicans. But to have the last of the Neros thus brought before him for a blessing was very staggering. Still, he liked the lady. She had a proper way of thinking, and talked with more propriety than her brother. But who were they? It was now quite clear that the blue madman in the silky beard was not a Prince Vinci Neroni. The lady was married, and was, of course, one of the Vinci Neronis by right of her husband. So the bishop went on learning. "When will you see her?" said the Signora with a start. "See whom?" said the bishop. "My child," said the mother. "What is the young lady's age?" asked the bishop. "She is just 7, said the Signora. "Oh," the bishop said, shaking his head, "she is much too young, very much too young." "But in sunny Italy, you know, we don't count by years," said the Signora, and gave the bishop one of her sweetest smiles. "But indeed she is a great deal too young," persisted the bishop. "We never confirm before But you might speak to her. You might let her hear from your consecrated lips that she is not a castaway because she is a Roman, that she may be a Nero and yet be a Christian, that she may owe her black locks and dark cheeks to the blood of the pagan Caesars, yet herself be a child of grace. You will tell her this, won't you, my friend? The friend said he would, and asked if the child could say her catechism. No, said the signora. I would not allow her to learn such lessons as those in a land ridden over by priests and polluted by the idolatry of Rome. It is here in Barchester, that she must first be taught to lisp those holy words. Oh, that you could be her instructor. Now, Dr. Prouty certainly liked the lady, but seeing that he was a bishop, it was not probable that he was going to instruct a little girl in the first rudiments of her catechism. So he said he'd send to teach it. But you'll see her yourself, my lord? The bishop said he would, but where should he call? At Papa's house, said the signora with an air of a little surprise at the question. The bishop actually wanted the courage to ask her who her Papa was, so he was forced at last to leave her without fathoming the mystery. Mrs. Prouty, in her second best, was now returned to the rooms, and her husband thought it well that he should not remain in too close conversation with a lady whom his wife appeared to hold in such slight esteem. Presently he came across his youngest daughter. Netta, he said, do you know who is the father of that Signor Vinci Neroni? It isn't Vinci Neroni, Papa, said Netta, but Vessi Neroni, and she's Dr. Stanhope's daughter. But I must go and do the civil to Griselda Grantley. I declare nobody has spoken a word to the poor girl this evening. Dr. Stanhope? Dr. Vessi Stanhope? Dr. Vessi Stanhope's daughter, of whose marriage to an dissolute Italian scamp he now remembered to have heard something? And that impertinent blue cub who had examined him as to his episcopal bearings was old Stanhope's son? And the lady who had entreated him to come and teach her child the catechism was old Stanhope's daughter? The daughter of one of his own prebendaries? As these things flashed across his mind, he was nearly as angry as his wife had been. Nevertheless, he could not but own that the mother of the last of the Neros was an agreeable woman. Dr. Prouty tripped out into the adjoining room, in which were congregated a crowd of Grantleyite clergymen, among whom the archdeacon was standing preeminent, while the old dean was sitting nearly buried in a huge armchair by the fireplace. The bishop was very anxious to be gracious, and if possible to diminish the bitterness which his chaplain has occasioned. Let Mr. Slope do the, and here Trollope lapses into cod Latin. It basically means, let Mr. Slope administer the blow, and I will administer the soft reconciliation in words. Pray don't stir, Mr. Dean, don't stir, he said, as the old man essayed to get up. I take it as a great kindness your coming to such an omnium gatherum as this. But we have hardly got settled yet, and Mrs. Prouty has not been able to see her friends as she would wish to do. Well, Mr. Archdeacon, after all, we have not been so hard upon you at Oxford. No, said the Archdeacon, you have only drawn our teeth and cut out our tongues, but you've allowed us still to breathe and swallow. Ha ha, laughed the bishop, it's not quite so easy to cut out the tongue of an Oxford magnate. And as for teeth, ha ha, why, in the way we've left the matter, it's very odd if the heads of the college don't have their own way quite as fully as when the hebdomadal board was in all its glory. What do you say, Mr. Dean? An old man, my lord, never likes changes, said the dean. You must have been sad bunglers if it is so, said the Archdeacon, and indeed, to tell the truth, I think you have bungled it. At any rate, you must own this. You have not done the half of what you boasted you would do. Now, as regards your system of professors, began the Chancellor slowly, he was never destined to get beyond such a beginning. Talking of professors, said a soft, clear voice close behind the Chancellor's elbow, how much you Englishmen prefer to learn from Germany, only you're all too proud. The bishop looked round, perceived that the abominable young Stanhope had pursued him. The dean stared at him as though he were some unearthly apparition. So also did 2 or 3 prebendaries and minor canons. The Archdeacon laughed. The German professors are men of learning, said Mr. Harding, but... German professors, groaned out the Chancellor, as though his nervous system has received a shock which nothing but a week at Oxford air could cure. Yes, continued Ethelbert, not at all understanding why a German professor should be so contemptible in the eyes of an Oxford don. Not but what the name is best earned at Oxford. In Germany the professors do teach. At Oxford I believe they only profess to do so, and sometimes not even that. You'll have those universities of yours about your ears soon if you don't consent to take lessons from Germany. There was no answering this. dignified clergyman of 60 years' age could not condescend to discuss such a matter with a young man with such clothes and such a beard. "Have you got good water out at Plumstead, Mr. Archdeacon?" said the bishop by way of changing the subject. "Pretty good," said Dr. Grantley. "But by no means so good as his wine, my lord," said a witty minor canon. "Nor so generally used," said another. "That is for inward application." "Ha ha," laughed the bishop. "A good cellar of wine is a very comfortable thing in a house." "Your German professors, sir, prefer beer, I believe," said the sarcastic little meager prebendary. They don't think much of either," said Ethelbert, "and that perhaps accounts for their superiority. Now the Jewish professor—" The insult was becoming too deep for the spirit of Oxford to endure, so the Archdeacon walked off one way and the Chancellor another, followed by their disciples, and the bishop and the young reformer were left together on the hearthrug. "I was once a Jew myself," said Bertie. The bishop was determined not to stand another examination or be led on any terms into Palestine. So he again remembered that he had to do something very particular and left Stanhope with the dean. The dean did not get the worst of it, for Ethelbert gave him a true account of his remarkable doings in the Holy Land. "Oh, Mr. Harding," said the bishop, overtaking the warden, "I wanted to say one word about the hospital. You know, of course, that it is to be filled up." Mr. Harding's heart beat a little, and he said that he had heard so. "Of course," continued the bishop, "there can only be one man whom I could wish to see in that situation. I don't know what your own views may be, Mr. Harding." "They are very simply told, my lord," said the other, "to take the place if it is offered me, and to put up with the want of it should another man get it." The bishop professed himself delighted to hear it. Mr. Harding might be quite sure that no other man would get it. There were some few circumstances which in a slight degree changed the nature of the duties. Mr. Harding was probably aware of this, and would perhaps not object to discuss the matter with Mr. Slope. It was a subject to which Mr. Slope had given a good deal of attention. Mr. Harding felt, he knew not why, oppressed and annoyed. What could Mr. Slope do to him? He knew that there were to be changes. The nature of them must be communicated to the warden through somebody, and through whom was it so natural as the bishop's chaplain? 'Twas thus he tried to argue himself back to an easy mind, but in vain. Mr. Slope, in the meantime, had taken the seat which the bishop had vacated on the signora's sofa, and remained with that lady till it was time to marshal the folks to supper. Not with contented eyes had Mrs. Proudie seen this. Had not this woman laughed at her distress, and had not Mr. Slope heard it? Was she not an intriguing Italian woman, half wife, and not full of affectation, airs, and impudence? Was she not horribly bedizened with velvet and pearls, too, which had not been torn off her back? Above all, did she not pretend to be more beautiful than her neighbors? To say that Mrs. Proudie was jealous would give the wrong idea of her feelings. She had not the slightest desire that Mr. Slope should be in love with herself, but she desired the incense of Mr. Slope's spiritual and temporal services, and did not choose that they should be turned out of their course to such an object as Signora Neroni. She considered also that Mr. Slope ought in duty to hate the Signora, and it appeared from his manner that he was very far from hating her. "Come, Mr. Slope," she said, sweeping by, and looking all she felt. "Can't you make yourself useful? Do pray take Mrs. Grantley down to supper." Sunday at the Indy 500. Mrs. Grantley heard and escaped. She doesn't want Mr. Slope to take her down to supper. The words were hardly out of Mrs. Proudie's mouth before the intended victim had stuck her hand through the arm of one of her husband's curates and saved herself. What would the Archdeacon have said had he seen her walking down the stairs with Mr. Slope? Mr. Slope heard also, but was by no means so obedient as expected. Indeed, the period of Mr. Slope's obedience to Mrs. Proudie was drawing to a close. He did not wish yet to break with her, nor to break with her at all, if he could avoid it, but he intended to be master of the palace, and as she made the same resolution, it was not improbable that they might come to blows. Before leaving the Signora, he arranged a little table before her, and begged to know what he could bring her. She was quite indifferent, she said, nothing, anything. It was now that she felt the misery of her position. Now she must be left alone. Well, a little chicken, some ham, a glass of champagne. Mr. Slope had to explain, not without blushing for his patron, that there was no champagne. Sherry would do just as well, and then Mr. Slope descended with the learned Miss Trefoil in his arms. Could she tell him, he asked, whether the ferns of Barchester were equal to those of Cumberland? His strongest worldly passion was for ferns, and before she could answer him, he left her wedged between the door and the sideboard. It was 50 minutes before she escaped, and even then unfed. "You are not leaving us, Mr. Slope," said the watchful lady of the house, seeing her slave escaping towards the door, with stores of provisions held high over the heads of the guests. Mr. Slope explained that Signora Neroni was in want of her supper. "Pray, Mr. Slope, let her brother take it to her," said Mrs. Proudie, quite out loud. "It is out of the question that you should be so employed. Pray, Mr. Slope, oblige me. I am sure Mr. Stanhope will wait upon his sister." Ethelbert was most agreeably occupied in the furthest corner of the room, making himself both useful and agreeable to Mrs. Proudie's youngest daughter. "I couldn't get out, madam, if Madeline were starving for her supper," said he. "I'm physically fixed unless I could fly." Everybody's packed in where they are in this room. There's no free movement. The lady's anger was increased by seeing that her daughter also had gone over to the enemy, and when she saw that in spite of her remonstrances, in the teeth of her positive orders, Mr. Slope went off to the drawing room, the cup of her indignation ran over, and she could not restrain herself. "Such manners I never saw," she said, muttering. "I cannot and will not permit it." And then, after fussing and fuming a few minutes, she pushed her way through the crowd and followed Mr. Slope. When she reached the room above and found it absolutely deserted except by the guilty pair, the Signora was sitting very comfortably up to her supper, and Mr. Slope was leaning over her and administering to her wants. They had been discussing the merits of Sabbath-day schools, and the lady had suggested that she could not possibly go to the children. She might be indulged in the wish of her heart by having the children brought to her. "And when shall it be, Mr. Slope?" said she. Mr. Slope was saved the necessity of committing himself to a promise by the entry of Mrs. Proudie. She swept close up to the sofa so as to confront the guilty pair, stared full at them for a moment, and then said as she passed on to the next room, "Mr. Slope, his lordship is especially desirous of your attendance below. You will greatly oblige me if you will join him." And she stalked on. Mr. Slope muttered something in reply, and prepared to go downstairs. As for the bishop's wanting him, he knew his lady patroness well enough to take that assertion for what it was worth, meaning it's a lie. But he did not wish to make himself the hero of the scene or become conspicuous for more gallantry than the occasion required. "Is she always like this?" said the Signora. "Yes, always, madam," said Mrs. Proudie, returning. "Always the same, always equally averse to impropriety of conduct of every description." And she stalked back through the room again, following Mr. Slope out the door. The Signora could not follow her, or certainly she would have done so, but she laughed loud and sent the sound of it ringing through the lobby and down the stairs after Mr. Proudie's feet. Had she been active as Grimaldi, she could not have taken better revenge. "Mr. Slope," said Mrs. Proudie, catching the delinquent at the door, "I am surprised that you should leave my company to attend on such a painted Jezebel as that." "But she's lame, Mrs. Proudie, and cannot move. Somebody must wait upon her." "Lame?" said Mrs. Proudie. "I'd lame her if she belonged to me. What business has she here at all? Such impertinence, such affectation." In the hall and adjacent rooms, all manner of cloaking and shawling was going on, as the Barchester folk were getting themselves gone. Mrs. Proudie did her best to smirk at each and every one as they made their adieu, but she was hardly successful. Her temper had been tried fearfully. By slow degrees, the guests went. "Send back the carriage quick," said Ethelbert, as Dr. and Mrs. Stanhope made their departure. There's only one carriage. He's got to stick around while they go home, and then it comes back to collect him. The youngest Stanhopes were left till the very last, and an uncomfortable party they made with the bishop's family. They all went into the dining room, and then the bishop, observing that the lady was alone in the drawing room, had followed them up. Mrs. Proudie kept Mr. Slope and her daughters in close conversation, resolving that he should not be indulged, nor they polluted. The bishop, in mortal dread of Bertie and the Jews, tried to converse with Charlotte Stanhope about the climate of Italy. Bertie and the Signora had no resource but in each other. "Did you get your supper at last, Madeline?" said the impudent, or else mischievous, young man. "Oh, yes," said Madeline. "Mr. Slope was so kind as to bring it to me. I fear, however, he put himself into more inconvenience than I had wished." Mrs. Proudie looked at her, but said nothing. The meaning of her look might have been thus translated: "If ever you find yourself within these walls again, I'll give you leave to be as impudent or affected or mischievous as you please," meaning you're never coming back. At last the carriage returned with the 3 Italian servants, and La Signora Madeline Vesey Neroni was carried out as she had been carried in. The lady of the palace retired to her chamber, by no means contented with the result of her first grand party at Barchester. There we have the concluding scene. It went horribly. It's full of physical comedy, which is not something that Trollope indulges in often. Dickens, you get it all the time. Trollope doesn't tend to do that often. He favors situational comedy, but not physical comedy. the shooting of the couch into the middle of the room, the fact that the wheel of the couch catches on the hem of a dress, that's very good. It's very well done, but it's a little bit unusual for this author. I love it. Absolutely love it. I can't get enough of those two scenes, those two chapters put together. And we get a slight hint in this chapter of what's coming. And that is that we're not done with the subject of the warden. We're not done with Hiram's Hospital. We had a whole novel about it last time, at the warden. But we've been told that by an act of Parliament, the Hiram's Hospital is to be put back on its feet. There is a warden to be put back in there. It's fallen into disuse. But there is a warden to be put back in there. There's a matron to be installed to oversee a hospital for female almswomen. And we've been told that all of Barchester is expecting that Mr. Harding will go back in that position. And in this chapter, we learn that the bishop certainly expects to do that. He expects to reinstall Mr. Harding, but there are one or two conditions. There are going to be one or two changes. So we know that's coming. And we'll just have to see what trouble we get into in the next chapter. So that is the next chapter of Barchester Towers, and we will move on next time. So I will see you then. Thank you, BookTube.